Should we start, Devansh?
Yes, sir. Consistent from Shweta. Shweta, could you hear me? So we'll start in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to session 5 of Tarabai Modak lecture series on the theme Science and Society. I would request Professor Sundar to please begin the session. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shweta. I hope you can hear me. Welcome back. We have finished half the series of eight lectures. We have finished 4. And in the remaining 4, well, I think in the first 4, we were trying to understand the nature of science and scientific knowledge, but constantly seeing its complexity, particularly its connections to social questions, its complexity related to the social. And we were also trying to see, what were the strengths of it and what kind of conditions define the possibility of scientific knowledge. It's not just enough to say, let's have scientific knowledge. To have something called scientific knowledge, you need to do certain kinds of things, preparing an object, looking at particular qualities of the object and not taking care of other qualities of the object, measurable concepts, for example, having various other kinds of pictures such as reductive pictures, looking at phenomena in terms of a larger idea of reductionism and so on. So to be able to produce scientific knowledge, we need a particular way of ordering the world, preparing the world for the scientific gaze, so that when science looks at the world, it is able to recognize what those objects it is going to study are. And as part of the preparation, and therefore the question of scientific knowledge is also related to conditions which allow such a knowledge to be possible. You cannot just go ahead and get whatever knowledge you want. There are certain conditions, certain conceptual conditions. So I'm really, unlike many science and society courses, I'm not looking at historical details and very particular kinds of relation of, political details of how science and society are related. Those are broad pictures which I'm invoking here. I want to get some conceptual clarity, because I think in the Indian context particularly, what we really lack are conceptual clarities, both about the meaning, purpose, and the strength of what sciences are, as well as lack of clarity about what constitutes the social or society. So today I'm going to look at the nature of social sciences, particularly the knowledge of social sciences. Before I come to it, like we have done every time, I'll just go through these some of the questions which were sent for the last class, and many of them will lead directly into the session for today. So there are not too many, and therefore we should be able to cover most of them. There was a question about which made the comment that scientists are concerned about improving quality of science. Is it also true in other disciplines like social sciences and humanities? Of course, it is very true, but there are people often who keep talking about the quality of what we produce and so on. But the difference is that the global nature of science, the uniformity of scientific discourse is different in the case of social sciences and humanities, in the sense that the objects with social science studies, it could be some global universal categories, but there is also a lot about the local situation. Talking about having Golgappa in Delhi, for example, is not a particular kind of a global phenomena which all the scientists can potentially study. Similarly, in literature, if you look at literature, for example, an analysis of let's say a novel written in Kannada is a kind of a local object, if you like, in that sense, and therefore it has its own implications for how to make it a science, how to make it part of global social science, etc. So the lack of very clearer forms of uniformity of evaluation, defining what quality is, becomes a big problem. And moreover, I think, given my own experience after having been in a research institute which was supposed to support social science and humanities, I can say that there is especially for the people who evaluate institutes, there's a major challenge in evaluating social science and humanities. It's because many times you don't know what they are producing, why we are producing the kind of stuff we do, and how to know when two people are applying for a job with, let's say, 4 papers each or 1 book each. What is the way by which you evaluate quality? So that's so we should recognize that the development of science as a global institution, is very much dependent on producing these kinds of global parameters. They're constantly concerned about global parameters, citation, impacts, H index, and so on. They're constantly worried about, how people are going to evaluate the quality of the work. And so it functions in a very different way in the other disciplines, and not as internationalized as the science case. There's another question which had 3 questions in it. I think all three important ones. One was about the question of quoting another person. This participant asked, should scientists embrace humanity in their work? And the other 2 questions are: is scientific knowledge anthropocentric, and what are the social responsibilities? Should scientists have social responsibility? Again, quick questions is, scientists to embrace humanity in their work, what does it mean? What do we want them to do? They're already trying to unpack in their eyes the so-called truths of the natural world, to understand natural phenomena in a way that allows us to control them, duplicate them, replicate them, build on them, etc. So what more do you want them to do? Like one of my physicist friends said, why should we now take responsibility? I'm already doing physics. What is it you are asking me to do now? Right? So I think the only argument you can raise in this context is to say that, look, science is a public good. It's created by the public. It's created by the public in the sense, in terms of the funding of the public, of course. It's not just funding. Every time people reduce everything to funding, we know that there are issues about funding. It's not just about funding. There's a social prestige to working in the fields of science and technology. There is, you have other kinds of benefits, and there are a large number of other benefits one can think of, and therefore the kind of social responsibility is something which is important. I was talking to somebody a couple of days back, and this person was saying, so many people have been badly hit by the COVID. I know personally of people who have been in many disciplines and many kinds of human activities, not just business, in arts. Many of them were teachers of arts and professional artists who have paid a huge price in this COVID time because there's no money. They have had to close institutions down for their own survival. They don't know what they have to do. Teachers have had this problem and so on. But, this is not to make a point. It is, my friend was telling me this. He said the only people who have not had a cut in their salary, who have been getting their, I don't know if it's large, less, or whatever, it's good pay, are the science community. Our science institutes, they've all been getting their salaries, and I think that should be the way. There's absolutely no reason to say they shouldn't be getting it. And but the question it raises is, a society which is paying such a huge price for the COVID in terms of the millions of its citizens, not just the migrant laborers, a large number of the middle class, have a very have very different rules for one group of people. That's the privilege. That's the elitism of science, and that's great. I mean, that's why it's state patronage to such an extent. But having that benefit, does it not automatically include responsibility? That's a question we should be asking them. Not because they're doing a kind of a charity to say I'll also be responsible. No, there is an intrinsic relationship, and also because the impact of the sciences on society are far greater than any other human activity. And because their impact is so much on society, do they have a responsibility? So the questions automatically come from the point of the definition of science within a society. And the more difficult question is scientific knowledge anthropocentric? This is a very difficult question because, it needs a lot more background to be able to meaningfully understand what this could mean. One way to understand this is to say all the truths we talk about science are because we are humans. So in principle, if animals did science, did physics, chemistry, biology, etc., they probably would look at the world very differently. Then the question which you can raise is this: what then is the truth of the natural world? Aren't there some things which are factual and truthful about the natural world, whether it is for human beings who study it or whether it's for animals who study it? Whether it's for men who study it or whether it's for women who study it? Or whether it's for Americans who study it or Asians and Africans who study it? Can we even understand that? So you can see why there's such a reaction whenever you use terms like African science, Islamic science, Indian science, etc., because you want to think science is just one which is talking about quote unquote truths of the natural world. But if it is anthropocentric, then does it imply that human limitations, human structures influence the truths we discover and talk about in the natural world? Could that be possible at all? If we get some time to come to feminist epistemology, I'll give you some examples how it is possible that it could be different. Just a very quick answer to why, how to think through this question without answering yes or no, because there's no simple answer yes or no, is that when humans look at the natural world, our visual structure influences what we see. That is, if we had 20 different eyes in front of the face, the room would not look like this to me. For a bee with a very complex eye structure, which is 180, 360, that kind of mobility in that movement of the eyes, on the top of the head, the 180-degree movement, very complex eye system, the room looks different. For some insects, the room looks curved, not straight. So the fact that we look at the room as straight is also related to the way our lenses in our eyes are. So if that is the case, if vision, the way we see the world is influenced by the biological structure of our human body, and the way we understand the world depends on our cognitive structures of the human self, the way we understand, the way we know, the way we infer and so on, those are all structures of cognition, right? And if that is the case, then why should not the truths of sciences be dependent on this to some extent? Okay, I would say that a large amount of scientific methodology, in principle, the power of the idea of scientific methodology arises from this constant attempt to remove the individual from the truths of science. That is, we know that it is Einstein who thought of E equal to mc squared. So was there a human, cognition, human perception which made him say E equal to mc squared? Or do you want to say that E equal to mc squared is something which represents something factual about the world? Now, science will want to say it is representing something factual about the human world. But how do you move from the point that it is Einstein as an individual who thought of this E equal to mc squared, and then it becomes acceptable as the factual truth of the world? What is that path which takes you from having your idea of a human mind with all its prejudices, experiences, etc., into how does it get converted into an impersonal bit of knowledge? That, to me, is the real essence of scientific method. Much of what we do in terms of evidence, empiricism, theory, etc., are all revolving around this tension. And what is the tension? How do I remove the human being away from the utterances of science? Because science is telling us so many things, wonderful stories about universe, black holes, DNAs, corona, virus, etc., etc. How do I remove the human from it? How do I remove the human subject from it and present it as if it is a neutral, factual statement which only talks about nature? So if we understand it in that way, some scientists might say, well, it is not anthropocentric because that's what scientific method is. Now, I think philosophy, history, and the sociology of science shows that it's too easy a claim to make. There are many other social factors which are involved in the movement from an individual insight to becoming a fact of the world. And that is, far more complex. This is what science studies is really about. It is also, so the next question is about today's science, Eurocentric. Again, it comes back to the question, related question, if the anthropocentric is, can you call today's science Europe driven by European interests or European scientists or whatever that means? If you mean by Eurocentric, does it mean that when Newton said the force of gravity is m1 m2 by r squared, is that British centric or English centric? Is it something which is true for all the British citizens in Newton's time and maybe afterwards? What does that imply when what could it mean to say it's Eurocentric? Again, it's just like some people claim that science is male centric. It's very much a dominant vision of the male. And there are good arguments for saying why. I'll just give you one argument, because to set up the epistemological argument, the arguments at the level of knowledge, we can do it. Let me see, there's enough interest, we can come back to it. But at least one quick question, as a science is a social process, immediately shows why it can be Eurocentric, etc. Which is, whenever science or anything develops in order along with the preoccupations, desires, and interests of a particular group in a society, then it becomes that centric. So in a society, if a society is built and ordered according to the interests of the males, for example, to take care of the interests, desires, and expectations and motivations of the males, so the interests of the males, then you would say it's a male-dominated, male-centric society. In the same way, if you ask what are the kinds of questions we have asked in the sciences, and it's not about what the answers are. If you really look at what are called within philosophy of science as research programs, for example, major questions which you're asking about the world, then definitely they are influenced by interests of various societies, dominant European. I think it's okay to say this, what I'm going to say now, because it's a time of the Black Lives Matter and a lot of discussion around this is there. We could say that it is the interests of the white societies. And it's something we need to think about, in the sense, the very act of saying, for example, suppose we might all think, oh, cloning is very good because it's part of biology, everybody is doing it, or building these, these virus. People talk of corona. One of the things that you've been hearing about is the fact that corona was probably built in a lab. Now, whether that's true or not, that's become now a big political question. But we know that there are many of these extremely dangerous biological organisms being produced in labs. Okay, so why would they want to produce these things? Why would they produce them knowing that by some crazy accident, if one thing goes out, you're just seeing something much more milder thing called corona, which has created havoc in the society. Why is it that we would think that the scientists have the right to produce these kinds of organisms in kinds of highly protected labs? What interest does that serve? What kind of knowledge is it giving you in the context of scientific knowledge, right? So definitely, we know that a large amount of scientific production, both science and technology production, has been driven by defense, military defense, and various related domains. So many inventions are related to the kinds of military power you think you need to have. Why? Why do you need to keep building these extremely complex, more and more powerful guns when we already have enough guns which can destroy all of us 100 times over in 2 seconds? And the fact that this has become a problem in American society is just a reflection of this. What is the point? What is it that drives the production of that? And remember, the technology is not just a simple thing at all. To say, oh, let me build a faster, whatever gun, not faster, where more bullets come out or whatever it is, where they can cause more greater destruction. But why? What is it that you think we are doing when we invest enormous amount of money and effort and thousands of scientists who work at it? And how do scientists work? They may not work directly on building that gun. There are scientists who will be working on certain materials in the material science labs. There are people who will be working on mechanical systems, which allows this kind of things to produce, and on bullet technology. There are thousands of small things which are developed by scientific community all over, and then it gets put into these kinds of machines. What is the interest they're all serving? Whose interests are they, right? So I think, therefore, the question whether science is male-centric, whether it's Eurocentric, whether it's white-centric, whether it's war-centric, whether it's capitalism-centric, etc., which thereby all these terms meaning that it is dominantly influenced by the interests of these groups. If we say that, under that meaning, I think it's very reasonable to make that argument. And that's why when people talk about science in India or Asia or Africa, for example, it is very difficult for our scientists to really work on various problems which confront Indian society, because it's not part of global science. And you'll have to somehow recover this, make it part of global science in some sense. So when you are doing something else, some might say that you are functioning according to the interests of other groups which set the research agenda. And that's one of the problems in sciences in other societies like ours, is that the research agenda, what becomes a major research problem, what becomes a problem which all the scientists around the world will look at, that is very often not dictated by what is happening in India. Okay, so we can go on about this. So I'm going to skip very quickly to that, because my response here already answers the other questions. The one about science teachers will come back to in the next session on science education. And what I was saying is also related to the fact how the social shapes scientific knowledge. We'll see more and more of that. There are two very quick questions, again, on empiricism and objectivity. I've already made some comments about it earlier. We'll see if I can say something more later. There's also a question which asks why you are not talking about Kuhn and Popper. Well, I'm not talking about very specific authors for a very good reason. I'm trying to set up a system where we can focus on trying to have certain kind of conceptual clarity for our, in the context in which we are functioning. That's why I want to look at science and society. This is not a general introduction to the literature survey in science and society, but how do we think through this problem in the Indian context? Of course, we did discuss that day about Kuhn. Popper is also an important influence. But I'm sure you will, when you go back and look at it, you will see that many of the things I've been saying hopefully will make it easier to read Popper and others. And I'll just stop with the last question, which is that is only scientific knowledge certain, universal, and reliable? And we should remember that this point itself is based on a prior question. Is only mathematical knowledge certain, completely certain, universal, etc.? So when we talk about scientific knowledge, remember that the first very important idea of method comes when you want to model the idea of empirical sciences. That is science of the empirical world, science of this messy real world in terms of, ideal mathematical objects. An object like numbers like 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. They do not decay, they do not get disease, they do not grow old. They are just 3, 4, 5, 6. That's it. That and knowledge associated with such ideal entities. That's the aim, the goal of scientific knowledge. And so to say that is science is the only one which can guarantee us this? In other words, is mathematics the only one which can guarantee us such kind of knowledge? We can discuss this in terms of theology and so on, but we could even ask what we'll be doing now when I talk about knowledge in the social sciences is, why do you want that kind of knowledge? What purpose does it serve you? So I wanted to come back to this question, which we discussed extensively in the last session. We looked at different kinds of knowledge systems, and we were asking the question, sometimes it's useful to ask not what that knowledge is, what purpose, why do you need that knowledge? And because once I know what I need it for, I can define my knowledge to be able to do that particular function. And so we can see this, therefore, so we could go back and ask the question, why do I need some knowledge about something which is completely universal, independent of which society, who is thinking about it, what their history is, what their gender is, what their religion, caste, class, ... is. What kind of a knowledge is that, first of all? Secondly, how does that kind of a knowledge help me in doing what? So if we keep that in mind, I want to come to this larger question of knowledge in the social sciences and ask the question, what is the kind of knowledge in the social sciences? Again, why are we talking about social sciences here? Because I want to look at the relationship between science and society through this extremely important influence which happens in the 19th century, with the early parts of the 19th century onwards, most notably associated with Auguste Comte, at least in the beginning, and then it develops as a set of disciplines called the social sciences. And we are already seeing that the influence of the idea of science on society is very much represented in the knowledge domain by this thing called the social sciences, which is very loosely put, to have knowledge about societies in the way sciences have knowledge about nature. So let's assume that, like physics, chemistry, etc., biology gives us knowledge about the natural world. The question for Comte and post-Comte is to ask the question, what kind of knowledge can I get about this thing called society, just like there's something called nature, in a way in which it is objective, like natural science, whatever that word objective means there. Is it possible for me to derive these questions of knowledge? So one of the most important influences, because this is at the level of knowledge production, it's about copying methods of doing and learning and knowing from one discipline called the natural sciences into creating another set of discipline for the social sciences. And we know that social sciences consist of different disciplines, sociology, anthropology, economics, etc., and history, for example. Sometimes it's put in humanities, sometimes social science. So you could ask us a question, is the idea of knowledge in economics, anthropology, and I also put education as a larger domain in social sciences, are they all the same? Or is it something else? Are they different in each one of them? Again, we could discuss a lot about this. I'm going to skip some part of it. I want to say the main things before I go into the more nitty-gritty questions of understanding societies. So you could then ask this question, just like we said, knowledge in natural sciences gives us knowledge about, let's say, laws of nature, or about how things evolve, move, grow, etc., etc. What are the dynamics of things in this world and so on. We could ask, what is the knowledge in the social science about? Is it knowledge about something called society? Is it about individuals in that society? Is it about groups within that society? Is it about institutions within that society? Because there are a very large number of institutions which constitute what a society is. And if I know that knowledge, this is what I produce in the social sciences, what is the purpose of this knowledge? Why do I want that knowledge? If I want a knowledge about a group, for example, why do I want that knowledge? Is it because I want to know how groups are working? Is it because I want to control them? If I naively look at the idea of scientific knowledge in terms of reproduction, predictability, control, etc., then the moment I say I want scientific knowledge with all the purpose and the conditions behind it, is it because I want to control how I study this society? Does it give me a better ordered society? And remember, that's a very important part of what we understand as societies, especially for various worldviews which thinks that human beings cannot live together and that you need somebody to keep us all together. Otherwise, if left ourselves without rules, okay, we are just going to destroy each other, kill each other, whatever, right? And somehow, therefore, you need knowledge in order to control all of us, because we are absolutely incorrigible individuals who don't know how to live with others. Is that really the case? Are there other models of society which would say, no, that's really not how people are, that's not how groups are? Whose interest groups does that work towards? Whose views of the world is that about humans? That, society plays a very important role in the context as control, something which we can see in the present politics of today, for example, across the world. So to give you just one example, to see how differently the purpose influences what you would call as knowledge. So one of the things is, in the context of management studies, you could argue that the very idea of getting knowledge from organizations, for example, there was a whole big movement some years back, many of you might remember, called knowledge management, became a very important field within management studies. And these are ways of discovering tacit knowledge in organizations, unrecorded knowledge, etc. Why do you need all that knowledge for? Why do we need all this human behavioral systems knowledge within management studies, etc.? Is it just to make people who work more productive and efficient? So is that purpose defining what you are searching for within that discipline, right? And this is true, as I said, I'm just pointing out how across, whether you move from the sciences, natural sciences or social sciences, similar preoccupations move across. So I'm going to take a little bit of time here to look at one example of anthropology and try and look at what is this kind of a question, what are the implications of that? Why did I choose anthropology? For a variety of reasons. I think it's one of the more interesting subjects within the social sciences. It is also something which has strongly resisted this larger question of whether it is social studies should actually be called a social science. It is also something which a large number of Indian students do. In fact, I find the number of people who as part of their research work, if I ask them what are they doing, almost everybody who works in social sciences I know are doing field work. Field work can mean many things. Some people just give a questionnaire and get it filled out. Some people go and sit and watch some people, talk to some people. Anthropology department, some people who insist a lot more training and all that, they have far more engaged field work, etc. But they're all still doing something, quote unquote, called field work. And this raises the question, therefore, why are they doing all that? What are they trying to do? Is it that they're trying to generate knowledge? And what kind of a knowledge? How do you define knowledge in anthropology? What is the definition? What is it that you say, oh, I know? I know this. What does that know refer to? What does it know about in anthropology? And again, why the question of anthropology? Because, again, the history of anthropology has had very interesting discussions on the link between anthropology and colonialism. And we know very well that when people have gone to study others, right? And you ask, why do you want to study others? And I often ask this because I've been engaging with a lot of students in social sciences. And whenever I do any of my workshop with them on writing, etc., we always come back to this question: why are you studying the people you go to study? It can be many types of communities. It can be tribal communities. It can be communities in the urban slum. I'm giving you classic examples of what they study, right? And you ask them, why are you doing this? Because internationally, anthropology does this. They send people from Germany and the US, and students come for PhD and spend 1 year with our people, with certain communities, and they learn the language, they stay there, and then go and write a thesis about them or write papers about them. What are you doing when you're doing it? Are you producing knowledge about those people? Knowledge about a group or knowledge about individuals? And why is that knowledge important for you? Right? Because remember, like I often tell my students, and I've told this so many times, I'm sure they hate me for this, which is that, I tell them that, look, I would love to go and study people like Amir Khan and Shah Rukh Khan, these big Bollywood stars. They live, I'm sure they live a very interesting life, if nothing else. And I want to go and do participant observation. I want to sit in their house for 1 year and sit with them, stay with them, tell them, give me a small room, I'm going to stay here and watch what you people are doing. And I'm going to talk to you and get all information from you about your lives. You think that's going to happen? Is there an inherent hierarchy in who studies and who is being studied. That hierarchy, is it always present in any act of trying to know? Anytime when you say that I want to know something, is there a hierarchy between the knower, the person who thinks they want to know, and the object that is studied? In the case of inanimate world, the object I am studying, for example, let's say my specs, is already inanimate. Obviously, there's a huge hierarchy between this object and me. I can do what I want to this object. I can just throw it and break it down. You know, that's one way of representing this hierarchy. But why is it that we think we can always go and study those below us, quote unquote below us? How many Indian students go and study powerful political structures in the US? How many of them will say, I want to go study Trump? And how many of them are going to get permission to even enter that place to study? You won't even get visa to cross the country. So what is it? Is there a problem with this very idea of knowing? And I'm using anthropology not as a critique of anthropology. It's, I think, you know, much of my work is moving more and more towards it, as we can see in the last two books which I've written with Gopal also. I think it's one of the, to me, it's a very, very important discipline. It captures a very profoundly important philosophical questions within it. And you can see, I mean, it's not an accident that in the Western tradition, that it is a philosopher like Kant who writes the major introductory ideas on anthropology. So there is something very important about it, because it's all, after all, about the logos of the human in some sense, trying to understand what is a human. But the moment the question of knowledge comes into it, do all these problems occur? So area studies, as you know, many of you who don't know, very quickly, it is that it becomes as a way to study societies. Like you'll have Middle East studies. You'll have now everything, India studies, China studies. India studies, all the big major universities in the world have India studies. And what do? They'll have some 2 or 3 people sitting there with some few students there who will come, see something about, spend some time here, watch some movies, talk to you, eat pani puri on the road, etc. And then represent this society back in different ways. I'm not critiquing it. I'm just telling you that within this act, what is the self-consciousness of this question about what constitutes knowledge? What kind of a knowledge is it? What is it used for? Is this knowledge universal, atemporal, repeatable? You know, what is that kind of an object? And who are they actually studying? What are the objects which are being studied? And the fact that you are studying humans, can it influence the methods of analysis, methods of study? Which is very obvious, because as I can take the specs and see at what pressure it breaks. I can't do that with human beings. Thankfully, you know that even anthropology research needs ethics committee clearance. You can't just go and say, I'm going to do this. It's become all over, but I think in some sense, the ethics clearance has also just become a checklist. But I still have hope for the discipline of anthropology that it will regulate far more better. And this is not something new. There was a debate in the American Anthropology Association a few years back about whether anthropology should be called a science. And there's a lot of response after that meeting. Media reports, including I think the New York Times, wrote articles saying the anthropologists want to remove the word science from anthropology. And then the AAA wrote a response to it saying, no, that's not true. But there was really a very important debate about what is it that could be science within anthropology. So there's a very short piece I wrote for the International Encyclopedia of Anthropology called The Scientific Method in Anthropology, which really very quickly summarizes some of these points. But I think part of the larger question there, and you can read it, it's a very short read. It goes back to this debate on whether anthropology, that is, in other words, again, I'm using anthropology because all of us at some level are doing something of anthropology when we are looking at people, when we stereotype communities, when we look at somebody else and say, oh, they are like this, these people are like that, and so on. You're essentially producing knowledge about communities, practices, and so on. And sometimes the knowledge is just a belief, opinion, and sometimes it's hate, talk, etc. But still it is functioning with a very proto-anthropological mood, a movement of proto-anthropology, I would say. So one of the discussions we have in that, which you can also read in my short piece, is that when they talk about in this debate, that we recognize that when you talk about the questions anthropology as science, that you recognize there are different methods. to do anthropology. And so one is the scientific, and the other is the humanistic. The scientific is what we have seen in the other natural sciences. It's theoretical. Statistical is, as I said, as close to the mathematical when it deals with the probability question. Nomothetic is law-like principles, talking about phenomena in terms of law-like behavior, etc. And the humanistic is largely something to do with language. It's to do with understanding the historical context, bringing the question of historical, starting from the ideas of experiences, which is the phenomenological. It is very interpretative, because for even today, and this is again a question I often ask these anthropology students, and I don't understand this, and a social scientist should tell me in social science institutes why this doesn't happen, which is that one of the most important tools in this humanistic method of studying societies is to, like in participant observation, so-called qualitative methods in the social sciences, is that you go sit with communities, you talk to them, you record them, you take down everything that they say, etc. So you have some rules for how you go to the field, how you engage in the field, and so on. But eventually, you're doing a lot about language. You are asking them some questions, or you're just observing them. Your informants, quote unquote, a terrible word, which has many other connotations, either as the natives and informants and so on. I mean, I think, we know the difficulty in using such words, but they are telling you something. And then you go write something about it, okay? Because you become the expert on them, because you have talked to many people in the community, you write about it. But this interpretator needs a basic understanding of what language is. What is a language? How does language make meaning? How do you interpret the various questions about meaning? Which philosophers of language, of course, have broken their head about extensively. And then what I find very interesting and very troubling sometimes is that we produce an enormous number of social science students in India, most of whom go into some kind of this field work if they do higher studies in their master's and PhD. And yet, their exposure to understanding the phenomena of language, I'm not saying they should all be taught philosophy. It might help if there are good philosophy teachers to teach them, but, they enter into the field without even understanding the complexity of how to interpret what a language is, what people are saying, what kind of meaning is produced, and so on. So there are very serious questions which any attempt to get knowledge about other humans, other groups, raise. And these all become questions of method, scientific method or humanistic method. And I want to just leave you with this suggestion rather than discuss more into it. Maybe if there are questions, we can come back to it. That what you study in anthropology, as you said, it could be about kinship, relations between people. Some of the classic work in anthropology. Now there are lot of work in anthropology on rituals, emotion, body. It opens up a completely different domain of exposure to this work. And we can ask, what kind of objects of study are they? What kind of object is emotion? How does emotion become prepared as an object of as an object for scientific analysis? How does the idea of rituals get prepared and get amenable to an analysis through the scientific method? What are we doing with them if you want to use scientific method to study these objects? How should they be? And when you do this, is that really desirable? So this is about how we look at the questions of knowledge. And we can go back and remember in the last lecture, we discussed about the conditions for this knowledge, the presuppositions about object, subject, the distinctions between them, the stability of the object when I'm observing it, etc., etc. So again, I'm not going to rehearse that points we have discussed. The basic question we are asking is, if society has to be scientifically studied, and we are saying, it's good to do scientific study or do humanistic study is perfectly fine, except that you build a hierarchy and say qualitative methods means you're not producing good knowledge in anthropology. Somehow you produce quantitative methods, you show graphs, you show statistical techniques, you suddenly have made that knowledge more legitimate. Although you might have lived in a society for 5 years and you say something about it, it is not legitimate. It is about common people who live within societies, who know what a society is, and yet what they say about it cannot be said as a science, quote unquote science, including within anthropology. They'd say, at the most, they'll say, go write a novel about it. What is the big difference between what an anthropologist does and this? And many times when they make this hierarchy, it's based on an assumption that you have not done this subject-object divide. You still belong to the the community you study, so you are prejudiced. So, and with the assumption that anthropologists who go into the field are not prejudiced, they don't have to be mentally prejudiced. They are conceptually prejudiced. And that takes a long time for these students to learn that you can be conceptually prejudiced. When you come and look at a community, you come in with certain kinds of conceptual prejudice. And of course, good anthropological training is to say, don't go with your own concepts, discover concepts in the field. They say it, but for that, they should really understand the meaning of concepts. And the huge debate on what concepts are, how can communities possess concepts, etc. So, as I said, I'm not trying to establish this as a criticism of anthropology. I'm trying to pose the challenges to certain kinds of studies of societies. And how do we understand society? Because ultimately, we want to understand each other who live in this world. We want to understand how all of us can live together. What does it mean? What kind of understanding do I need in order for all of us as a group to live together? If you like, you can add in peace. What is that? If that is an ideal aim of a society, then what kind of understanding? The word understanding, you can see, is already a big word, which among other things might imply knowledge and so on. But they're asking, what kind of understanding do I need? And what is the purpose of that understanding? If the purpose of that understanding is to live together in peace and not to control certain groups within societies whom I don't like, okay, or who do not behave like me, then is that the kind of knowledge that you really want? Is that a knowledge which comes from certain kind of preoccupation with certain definitions of knowledge, which says legitimized, valid knowledge is that which will allow you to predict and replicate and control systems? What if I don't want to do that? So just as a thought experiment, I can pose this question to you. Can you study society like you study art, music, literature, religion, and science? It's not that science is not part of this, okay? Because scientific approach gives us very important bits of knowledge which the other ways of a study may not. But what has happened and what continues to happen is that you privilege that and place the scientific method in a hierarchy, and if they have state patronage, like it happens in societies today, then you are completely removed from understanding my fellow beings in my society through other modes of definitions of knowledge and study and understand, where my purpose is to be able to be with them, not know them to, control you or to know what it is, how I can manipulate you or how you will start behaving like me, how you will please me. But just like you study other very important, very rigorous, very difficult fields like art, music, literature, and I put religion here not just as religious studies, that is studying the various issues of religion, but also varieties of religious experiences. Remember when we talked about religion in the last session, I was talking about what is the purpose of religious knowledge. Suppose I'm reading all these religious texts. What is the purpose? Am I trying to do it because I want to have control over God, if God or divinity is a kind of a being which is one kind of an object of study within religion? And as you saw, that need not be. There are many other ways of looking at religious knowledge. Or is it that I attain that knowledge or attain that understanding in order to have a particular experience? That experience could be of liberation, oneness, whatever. And that's not about knowing you in order to control you or do things with you or say that I know this about you. So can we study societies like this? And are these better forms of studying societies than certain forms of mimicking scientific study of societies? But it doesn't mean no scientific, because scientific study of societies are extremely important, for example, for policy purposes, again about control. My favorite example is about poverty. You can study a social phenomena like poverty. How do you study poverty? If you want to study it as a scientific method, what would I do? I first convert the theme, the concept of poverty, the phenomenon of poverty, into something amenable for scientific study, which is first define it with measurable concepts. So the moment I define poverty in terms of per capita income per day, how much per day earning, or about the number of calories per day of food that I get, or whether I possess a phone or car or house, all these kinds of parameters which can be measured, then I am doing, and it's a very important thing to do, because through that you can do policies. You can clearly say, some 23, whatever, to 200 million are below poverty line. You can put a number to it. But suppose you just say, I think everybody who does not have certain, so-called qualitative terms or vague terms, you may not be able to say exactly 200 million are below poverty line. But we should remember that the data you produce depends on the concepts you begin with. There are various ways of socially studying the social phenomena called poverty, okay, which can give you great insight into poverty, which can even make you create policies and engagement with poverty, like these dominant scientific methods through economics, particularly through the Trojan horse of economics, become so dominant. You could do that. We have to see what it is before we even begin to start by thinking this is the only way we want to study some of these social phenomena. And my point here is that if you do this, expand on this notion of understanding and studying, then the very ideas of social processes, development, social change will all have very different kinds of meanings probably. Okay, and this is just a larger kind of a statement I'm making here. One can explore this in different ways, because for me the main point why I'm saying this is because we are coming back to the question of what is this thing called society? Why do I want knowledge about it? How do I study it? What does it really mean in the engagement between science and society? That's really where I'm working towards. And obviously there is one elephant in the room, and that's the word society. Okay, and that is, you have to unpack society like we did for science. That the word society, or the word which keeps getting attached to it all the time, called the social, are they universal terms? Do they represent certain kinds of common universal phenomena across different societies, across different socials? And this is actually the question we set out, Gopal Guru and myself set out when we wrote the book Experience, Caste and Everyday Social, which is really to understand why we keep using the word social all the time. Social justice, social media, social this, social science, hundreds of things. You keep social movement, social change, etc. What does that word social actually mean? It functions as if it's meaning the same thing in all these terms. It is not. Again, our whole book is a struggle through trying to unpack what it could mean, particularly in the Indian context. So one could say, therefore, one of the ways to look at it is to say if you unpack what society is and what the science is, we found that science has many parts. Science is not just about scientific method, because we saw there are many scientific methods which are practiced in different disciplines have different methods. There may be some similarities at the metaphysical level, at the philosophical level, but there are all these different kinds of things, even in terms of methods. In terms of knowledge, there are many different types of scientific knowledge which are present across the many different disciplines. But science also has another meaning as an institution. Science is also has another meaning as a concept. And there are different meanings for the very idea of science. Similarly, society has many parts, and you can do that breakup, etc. I'm just using this very quickly in order to explore one very important relation between science and society. That is, science has many elements, society has many elements. So when we say relationship between science and society, both of these act as if they mean one thing, but they don't. You will have to see which of the parts of science are relating to which part of the society. And that is the complexity of this study of science-society relation. So when people try and use just one ideological meaning of science or one ideological meaning of society, then it is obviously a major problem. So when we look at science-society influences, for example, society has a very important concern about, let's say, defending that society. And there is one part of science which, let us say, which is about weaponry, creating weapons. So obviously the relationship between that activity of science related to weaponry will be more in touch with that society, that part of the society, the defense forces, for example, which is involved in the defense of a society. So, but that is not the general definition between science and society. It's nothing to do with scientific method. It's nothing to do with scientific rationalities and so on, right? So I'm saying this very quickly, and I know this is a thing because I really want to ask one very important question about the Indian society and trying to make sense of our local specific society we belong to and the relationship between science and that society. Because when we talk about any society, I mean, Indian is just an example here because, you know, people would say that the word society itself is a problem. There are many societies, so I accept all that. But we are trying to, I'm saying this because I'm coming to one important problem in the study of the relationship between science and society, which is very well exemplified by the STS handbook. The STS, it's a Science and Technology Studies handbook, the recent one, 2017 edition. It's a fat volume, and I can show this to you. I don't know if you can see this. I presume you can see it. It's a very influential text produced by the community of this Society of Social Science Studies and of studies in science. They are very powerful group of individuals who belong to STS. They, like other groups, exert enormous amount of influence on what is accepted as the correct study of science and society, science and technology, impact on society, etc. So and since it's such an influential book and it represents an organization which is the most powerful within STS, and therefore it speaks for the community of people who work on this field. And there are obviously a large number of people who work in this field. So this book has about 1100 pages. It's a fat book. You can actually use it to do weightlifting. If nothing else interests you in that book. And it becomes a very interesting comment by the editors of this volume that they are making a special attempt to capture diversity of authors from across the world. Because somewhere this group, community of science, technology studies people who have many of the influential books on science and society have come from this field. They are trying to capture the diversity of various societies, I presume, other than the white European, American, Australian societies. Great. So special attempt to capture the diversity. And what do they do with it? Given their special attempt to capture diversity, they then point out there are 5% of authors from Asia, related to institutions in Asia. 5% of all these this huge volume. And if this is the product of trying to be diverse, imagine the other influential, the 3 prior influential handbooks of science and technology studies. And it's actually interesting because, and they say, oh, well, we have 2 other papers, not 2 other papers from South America. So this raises a very important point. It raises a point which is that India and China, I mean, forget about many other countries from Asia and Africa, of course. India and China are the highest consumers, and together, if all of us join together from Nigeria, India, China, and so on, you not only have the highest consumers of scientific products, like scientific technological products, we have the highest number of scientists and technologists in the world. Just India, China alone is enough for that. But what is the problem? We have within that world society of people who study the impact of science and society relation, there is absolutely no representation, and I say absolutely no in the context of the amount of literature produced in this field. There are, of course, we know names from within the Indian community who are known within this, but I'm saying, and a very few handful, but where is our representation of our views of studying science? How is it that we understand the science society relation? How are we supposed to understand it? If we go to a professional discipline like science and technology studies, which studies science society relation, then I'm supposed to read all this handbook and so on, and I don't find anything which speaks to what is happening in India. Why is that? Either we are told they are totally indifferent to what is happening here, or they think that what they have said about science society holds good across. This universalization tendency within these discourses. I think, for example, the COVID discourse has completely duplicated this everywhere. Even when the government is doing certain ways it talks about the COVID discourse, it is duplicating global discourse about it, the global ways of talking about it. What constitutes the specificity of the science and society engagement in Asia and Africa, in societies which are very different? So, for example, in this handbook, some of the themes which I'm sure when you look at it, you say, yeah, this is also all around me. I'm sure all of you have something interesting to say about this. Democracy, social movements, inequality. These are all chapter themes which I'm talking here. Okay, it's not just some concept which is used there. These are specific chapters on these themes. Democracy, social movements, inequality, politics, race, gender, urban, finance, communication, aging, security. And where is the rest of the world? Nothing. It's not even present. In the official handbook of science and technology studies, other group of people who study science and technology, there is rarely a mention of non-white society. What is that implication there? What is it? I'm saying this also as a kinds of problems which arises in the study, not just in science as a community or about social science as a community, but even in the relationship, the engagement between them. Where are all the, one way to call it is non-white societies, where are they all? Considering that they are the largest producers and highest number of scientists and technologists in these societies. Is it racism, which would be very strong charge to put on these people? Is it just indifference? Or is it based on their idea that when they have talked about democracy and society in Britain and US and Germany and France and Australia, well, they say, well, all the Asians and Africans can just see this and see where it fits into their thing, because definitely it should be. Otherwise, your societies are anyway, so irrational because you're so religious societies and so on. So you forget about, make do with what there is. This is what our thing is producing. And this is based, and these arguments are based on on not accepting a fact of the qualitative difference between these societies and the impact of this qualitative difference on how you study science and society. Asian and African societies, while we may use the same terms like religion, gender, etc., have very different ways of engaging with these terms. And I think definitely European scholars know this. When the German philosophers wrote or took the position that there was no philosophy in Asia and Africa, I mean, and Gadamer goes to the point of saying there is no idea of knowledge in these societies, which to me, is unfathomable. I don't understand it. It is not. They were right at some point by saying that, well, our idea of religion is not the idea of religion in Asian and African societies. But working in an English language, where we also want to use the word religion, otherwise we get into so many other debates on what is the correct word for religion, which language will you use it in, etc., etc. When we have a global discourse in English, we have to recognize that they may talk about democracy in this handbook, or as I said, many of the other themes, including feminism and so on. But the societies engage with these concepts in a very different manner. We are not talking about the same thing. And this actually has very deep implication, and one of the examples which we can talk about, which is I think important, which has been much talked about in the context of India, is that, and this is, it is a global phenomenon in some sense, but because of a completely different history of science, religion, debate in these societies, it has been presented differently. In the context of India, which we know this well, Reni's work on the Ayuda Puja, for example, has many of these accounts of it. And you have seen this all around you. You have seen this, for example, when the ISRO scientists take a model of their rocket and the satellites to offer prayers in two major temples in the Dharmasthala and one in Tirupati temple. Okay. And when people pointed that out and the photographs of it came out in the media, of course, there was one group of people who were very upset and said, how can scientists do it? But for many of the scientists who are a part of it, it was quite indifferent. It's part of their cultural practices. And I'm not even going to enter into the question whether scientists should do that or not, because that's a lost question. It's not a question which is even rightly posed, in my view, because as one of the leaders of the scientific temper movement in India, in a meeting in the Indian Institute of Science where we were there, and he said this publicly, so I can share this with you. And he said that when he, along with some other scientists, were very concerned about the so-called drop in scientific temper, and he produced a draft of where he wanted a pledge, where all the people in the society to take a pledge to follow scientific temper. And then he says this in that meeting. He says the reason that pledge failed was that many Indian scientists refused to sign it, because that pledge said, they saw that pledge as saying that they are against religion also. And they did not want to do that. They did not think that there was anything wrong in possessing, or I don't know, whatever the thing called scientific temper is, and being religious, and that this was a false dichotomy which was being imposed on them. It was a scientific community which pushed back against this. So I'm not very bothered about the ISRO example. The ISRO scientists are among one of the far better science community within India. They have shown their capacity in producing, certain technologies and producing workable things within an Indian system far better than most other scientific institutions. And obviously, their competence is not in question either as engineers or scientists. And they do not see this major debate on this question about religion as being part of a cultural practice of science, in some sense. Okay, this is actually very complex and very troubling at various levels, but I don't want to take the naive oppositions immediately about it. I want to look at it by saying, look, the reason that this in our context, so immediately somebody might say, oh, do NASA scientists do that? Does it imply, that they're all more scientific tempered than Indian scientists? I don't know. I mean, I really don't think so. But I would, instead of even making claims about it, of which I know I don't have data about, all I can say is that the very ideas of religion itself is different. Part of the problem is, if you understand certain practices as religious practices, and then say this is what, this is where the conflict comes between doing science and religion, then we have to make sense of this by saying, what do these terms mean in the Asian and African context as against in so-called advanced West, where there's a great crisis of religion and where there are very different structures of religion. So would it be useful for us to look at it that way rather than naively use these kind of dichotomies, borrowed dichotomies, and say there's a, Indian scientists or don't have scientific temper? Part of it is based on this argument, which again I can't go into because that's really part of a central core of our book, the one I said, which I wrote with Gopal Guru, Experience, Caste and Everyday Social, where the social individual is a wrong binary. And just as one example, it's a far more complex picture, but one example to make sense of this question is that the role of family is extremely crucial in India, and that has great significance not just in science, but also, not just in society, but also in science. In fact, if there is one social group which has great influence on the practice of science and the function of society in India, it is the family. And the family, we need to understand what is a family in Indian context. Why is it that the family has the kind of influence on individuals, which includes not just what they should study, maybe sometimes what they should wear, but also to whom they should marry or how many children they should have, ... What kind of a society, how do we understand society which has this phenomena without critiquing it and saying, oh, these are all superstitious things, traditional societies and all that? Forget that. That comes, I don't want to say too much about it, but there is a lot of inheritance of particular Eurocentrism, particularly German-centric thinking about Indian societies. Their way of understanding what this crazy world that they saw around them called India. So how does this question of the family, which plays such an important role, how does it influence, how does it mediate the relationship between science and society? Very different from the US or Germany or UK. Where they are producing, or Netherlands, which also produces a lot of STS work. So when they write about all this about science and society, and they have written a large amount of stuff, 1,100 pages in this, and I'm like reading some of it and saying, look, what are they saying? What science? Which society are they talking about? I don't get it. So how do we factor in the specificities of the society? In what way? And another reason why the science and society relation globally cannot be incorporated naively in India, because we are a different type of a society. One way to understand it for our purposes here, I've called it producing societies and consuming societies, or copying societies. Many of these discussions, these are all seminal works on the STS, science-society relation. They talk about how they took the leadership in producing certain kinds of weapons, or certain kinds of industrial equipment, certain new disciplines related to nanotechnology, or many of the simple social media applications that are being produced, or the apps which allow you not to go out and engage with society, but have people come and give everything to you in your house. Many of them are influenced by the nature of those societies, and we copy them. We just download apps. We just buy phones. We buy computers, chips from somewhere, and we are producing societies, copying societies. And we need a different framework to understand science and society for these kind of societies. The kind of framework they use and they talk about, we have to ask how relevant is it for us, because they are talking about it in the context of autonomous producing societies which produce these science, the science which all of many other countries begin to copy. Because the hierarchy which science uses to the function of science in creating hierarchies of societies, right from Enlightenment project, and any knowledge is always used in this, including in traditional Indian societies. That has this very different way impact on the hierarchy of understanding the science society relation. So what I'm going to do very quickly today is to end here. I know there is it's 6:50 because I want to come back and show couple of very specific points about the Indian society. Okay, so let me end another 5 minutes, and then you can type in your questions, and I'll of course pick them up day after tomorrow. So we'll still, and you can send the questions by email also, and whatever you type in chat we can do. I think because let me at least end with these two particular questions, just to show the uniqueness of Indian society and studying Indian society in order to understand its implication to the question of practice of science. And there's a very troubling question, I mean, both the two troubling questions, both about gender and caste. I will go through it briefly, but we'll come back to it when we do science education tomorrow. I'll have to continue from this and enter into education. The question of science, caste question in science today is troubling. It is a problem. Okay, it is a problem. Although there are accounts now in the media, you might have read about enough of kinds of discussions among various groups, particularly Dalit groups, on how the institutes, high institutes of eminence and learning like IITs and other institutions, ISAs, IISc, and then this work on IIMs have all shown a system, just like this whole point about systemic racism, there's a systemic casteism, whether there are such practices exist in science in India today. Again, something very special to the relationship between science and society in the Indian context. Is there a systemic racism racism in some sense, but casteism, and also questions of exclusion. So larger questions of exclusions, do they operate systematically within science practice, science community in India today? Now, what would one say to this? Why would one say this? One could look at examples of numbers, just sheer numbers of the communities, of the various caste communities represented in our leading institutes. Or look at the caste community representation in our major institutions like the Department of Atomic Energy or Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO. Is there a completely skewed representation of people who belong to the society as against the people who are in these institutions? Now, you might say, well, that is because we have not had, they would say, some people who want to defend the status quo would say, there are people who have not reached that level of what we want in order for them to enter into our institutions, and therefore we cannot, it is not about systemic exclusion, it is purely about this thing called merit. Okay, this is it operates exactly in the case of caste and gender. Okay, but what we do not recognize is that the very idea of merit, okay, I mean, it's not that we do not, I'm sure many of you have recognized and thought about it because it's such an important question for education, that the very idea of merit is itself a consequence of this centric view we talked about. Okay, and it is a kind of a construction which privileges certain kinds of knowledge, and because it privileges certain kinds of knowledge, the idea of merit as against other terms like effort, right, the idea of merit serves primarily to exclude. So where does the idea of merit come from? How does merit operate as a social term, not just as a cognitive term? Merit is not about the marks. It's not about how fast you can solve some problems in arithmetic or geometry or mathematics or whatever, which is what the status quo is there in many of our educational entrance exams. You want to enter into management, you have to solve some maths problems. For what? It has become so bad that my friend who's an architect here, who teaches in architecture college, says that, he says, I want to have an entrance exam where I want to test their spatial reasoning, their capacity to be able to draw, perspectives and so on. He says, I can't do it because I have to give them a maths exam. And we choose them based on that. What is where? These are social categories produced for certain interests, to protect certain interests of certain communities. That's the only way we can understand this idea of merit, which operates in the context of science institutions today. It does not mean the people who are there are not meritorious. Obviously, they are meritorious. They are good people. They can do all that, etc. I mean, I'm not even getting into that debate. Okay, I don't want to even think about that. But the question we should be asking is, why does such a small percentage of the population of the country, whether they are forward caste, Brahmins, whatever, get to have so much of a hold on the knowledge institutions of the country? What is it that we are, how is it we define these notions of merit, which creates this kind of a situation and perpetuates it and is systematically reproduced, because the concepts which allow people in are reproduced socially. They are social concepts. They are reproduced socially repeatedly. And it's the same point of gender. The same troubling questions about gender representation in science institutes, the response to gender questions within science, and many other. I mean, I've sat in interview committees where I've seen, both in the context of caste and gender, things which, we just will shock you to know that these things happen in our best institutes even today. Is it just about privilege and interest? Can we even understand the relation between science and society without knowing how the society operates? What are the operational principles through which caste and gender gets mediated through many things, including the family within these organizations? I mean, the fact that people often say that Indian institutions, one of the greatest drawbacks of Indian institutions is we don't have, we don't develop good leadership. Leadership is not an issue in the sense there is no particular kinds of choosing and developing certain kinds of leadership skills. So many times our institutions, both public and private, the leaders of those institutions tend to act as patriarchal figures. And the fact that many of them say, oh, my institute is like my family, and they are not saying, even if they don't say you are like my children, there are people who will just look at them and say, I don't want to be your child. I don't want to be a part of your family. The institution is not a family. But the extent to which this has entered the public and private space in the institutions in India is so deep. And it is through that image, for example, through that image that caste and gender questions get perpetuated. Caste and gender exclusions get perpetuated. And why is that? I'll stop at this point, which is that I'll just state this point and stop it here. The root of the problem is that science is fundamentally a social institution. Doing science is fundamentally a social process. But the repeated told and the claim of the scientist is that it is asocial. It is not about notions of social interests, social dynamics, etc. It is just about individual brilliance, recognizing, seeing the truths of nature. Okay? What are we so worried about? What is our science community so worried about in calling science as a social institution? What is it that they think they're going to lose? Because once you recognize it as a social institution, the scientific products, scientific knowledge are part and parcel of these very complex social processes which are unique to India, just like they are unique to different societies, which means that our engagement between questions of religion, caste, gender, etc. also have to be uniquely mapped and understood by our social scientists. If that is the case, then science is a social institution under the patronage of governments with money of the larger community. So once we accept this, then I think we have a very different understanding of the relationship between science and the social. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry I couldn't stop 5 minutes before, but I wanted to finish the stream of the argument. And we will pick up the remaining part of this, the leftover, very little part of it. And then I want to look at education as a social commodity and the implications for science education if we understand science-society relationship in this manner. We can take questions, Devans or Ritesh, whoever is there.
Yes. Yeah. Perhaps we'll have a 2-minute space for participants to put down their questions.
Sure. If, like yesterday, there is something specific they want to ask, and if you think we can do a couple of them, we can take that while they are putting it down.
If there's any question, please raise your hand so that we can request you to frame your question. Ask your questions. I don't see any hands raised. Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think I can see Lallan asking something, but I can't hear. It's muted.
I see some questions coming in the chat box. I was just wondering if any of the participants would like. Yeah, there's a hand raised by Srajana. We invite her to ask her question.
Hi, Sundar.
Hi.
My question is actually about the trying to bridge the whole gap between the kind of violence that quantitative method can do in social sciences, and then how you highlighted that there is a lack of representation, a lack of situated representation in the sciences. And somehow I see that in trying to address that lack, the quantitative can actually come to the rescue, because you can systematically then look at trying to represent from all the so do you see a possibility where the quantitative method of the sciences can help itself instead of
Can help itself?
Yeah, can help itself and the social sciences.
Yeah.
Is it here a little bit?
Yeah,
Because,
and we know this.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
What I saw is that there is the lack of representation, the lack of situated clarity. Are there other ways of doing that kind of specific study? Because the first thing that anybody would jump to is say, okay, so let's just be politically correct. Let's get representatives everywhere, so we have things to show. I mean,
Yeah.
so the 5% can go up to 95%, but there could still be an underlying qualitative whiteness or qualitative.
Yeah, sure.
So
Okay. No, you're very correct. I agree with you. And I think there's also a very central question about in feminism, right? Because you could, because patriarchy can be produced by women. It's not about, while if patriarchal practices can be produced by institutions and people who don't have to be men, right? So this is the big challenge about how patriarchy is reproduced, even by people who sometimes suffer from it. So in the same way, this, I agree with you, quantitatively getting many people to write about it is, etc., may not be very representative. But I think it goes back to the question for me on what does it mean to represent oneself? That's a very important social science question, right? What does it mean to represent oneself? Why should there be a representation by myself or about our experiences in the larger STS world? It's because we bring our worldviews, our conceptual world of understanding into talking about a particular phenomena. It is not that what they have said does not map something in the Indian case. Of course, you'll find 10 different ways in which they map. And since our academic community is generally very polite, and we would all say, yeah, we'll use that work to say what is happening in Bangalore, Chennai, etc. But the point is that where are these conceptual questions, worldviews, different ways of looking at human relationship, for example. Look at friendship as an idea. How differently different societies formulate the idea of friendship. As I'm sure we've made a lot of jokes about this, but typically if you saw Indian films early on, that people of the same sex would be holding hands and walking. I mean, even today, I don't see it in cities because we've got too much hypersensitized about this question. But still in rural areas, in small towns, I still see this. Both boys or girls, they just be holding hands, sitting and talking and all that. Now, those were cultural notions of friendship, which are very different, which have been interpreted differently in different societies. And this is such a simple example. But all I'm saying is that these kinds of conceptual imagination and our interest comes from our worldview. If this is what many people, many scientists in India think about their own religious practices, then how can it become part of this vocabulary and discussion here, rather than being called, you're superstitious, you're blind, you're anti-rational, you're not rational, etc. There is a question about rationality and the problem with it. I'm not disputing that. But what is it? Who is there saying that this is not the way we should have a worldview about science and society in that sense? So quantitative tends to, the only big problem with quantitative philosophically, I would say, is that it tends to wipe out the differences. And many times differences are what are so important. The moment I say quantitatively that there are 10 people in the classroom, it's very different from naming each one of you or knowing who you are in the classroom. So the moment I say 10 people in the class, or I use a conceptual term like the 10 Indians sitting in the class, etc., really, erases the very complex differences which are present before me. And we need to ask what is the consequence of that kind of approach towards society. Maybe it works for the description of the natural world. And remember, that is also not a simple question. Why is it that some of the most important scientists have repeatedly been writing about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics? They're really puzzled, trying to understand why should mathematics work? And that is related to this question, right? So, yeah.
There are a few questions in the chat box. I don't see any more hand raises. Should we take up a question?
Okay, maybe I can take one or two quick questions. Something very provocative and something which we can fight a bit about. We can. Okay. Okay, feminist epistemology club. Let's see next session. I'll try and find. Basically, as I said about different epistemological systems is the same question we discussed in the Eurocentrism question. Whose privileged interest can I look at the world by? And it raises a larger question. So maybe it is also related to this question about feminist epistemologies. I mean, if I want to put it in a very crude sense, which a lot of people do, and which scientists often make fun of, is if women did science, would they do a different science? Would scientific knowledge be different? Would they be producing something which is completely different from what the men were doing. And does it make sense for us to, ask this question? In what sense could we even that sense make? What sense could it make? One is to say, well, maybe the categories they look at the world by may be very different. Okay, and again, I don't want to go into stereotypical categories of care and motherhood and all that, because they are also very socially constructed categories. But maybe that there are very different conceptual categories. You can see that culturally, very clearly that, for example, for a culture for which nature is not different from humans, that we follow a continuum. Okay, a very important part of many Asian and African cultures and aboriginal cultures, where the distinction between humans and nature is this larger continuum. And therefore, if you look at some of the most important discourses on ethics, narratives on ethics, like in the Jataka tales or the Jaina tales, or the Buddha Panchatantra tales, and so on, they are about animals speaking, trees walking, and these kinds of imagination spaces far more diffused. So that can have impact on how you even look at the activity of studying nature. That's what I mean. So definitely, therefore, if women, what we mean by feminist here, other than just saying feminist in just the political or activist sense, is to say a woman-centered perspective on the world. Then the question about the real serious question about feminist epistemology is, can a woman-centered reflection on the world with women-centered categories of describing the world, what kind of science can it produce? And what do we mean by science here? Doesn't mean exactly the same kind of mathematical, analytical, etc. It is just something which leads you to productive, evidence-based, comparatively sure knowledge. That's all. If you are going to teach, for example, suppose somebody discovers a method like through meditation, some Buddhist meditative technique, we are able to discover something about why the sky is blue, or that opens up new knowledge about the world around you, not in the way science would describe it, but different other knowledges about the nature around us, then would that not be a valid knowledge too? Scientific knowledge, it becomes valid because of its specific characteristics of control, reproduction, predictivity, etc. It is able to intervene in the world. What if I have a knowledge system based on categories and worldviews, whether of women or meditation or whatever, which gives me knowledge about the world, with which I am blissfully and happily coexist? That's it. I don't want to then take that knowledge and do something with it and build a big bridge or build a rocket and send you anywhere. I don't want to build that and blast you out into space. I just want to have that notion of knowing and meaning, so that we just exist with that thing we know. Coexistence. Isn't that a valid form of very desirable knowledge? Why should it not be knowledge? So, and this is not what people like Sandra Harding and others who take on this point about feminist epistemology. But I think part of the problem with many of these approaches, particularly from some of these questions on the sociology of science, is that they do not pay sufficient attention to the working of science. So when scientists encounter these, they don't even want to read it. First they say, I don't understand why they write all these big words. Then second, they will say, this is not what science, I don't know what they're talking about. And like when we discussed what feminists and scientists, when somebody said, oh, so Newton's law will be different, is it? But remember that Newton's law becomes the law that it is because of very specific methodological moves which Newton's make, conceptual moves of reducing this huge sun and the huge earth into mathematical points. If you hadn't done it, that equation was not going to fall from like an apple on a tree, which, by the way, that story is also apparently false. So what I'm saying is, yes, maybe if people represented the sun and the moon differently, represented the idea of motion separate differently, then of course you'll have a different knowledge system. And I think there are many endemic examples of how we can understand alternate ways of looking at what knowledge is being produced.
May I, if you permit me, and the audience permits, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Which is slightly perhaps provocative also.
Yeah, I'll take your question and just two more, just to think so that I can then put all this thing together. There's one on the environmental and also one on Bruno Latour and inequality. So I'll combine all of that with that after yours. Yeah.
Okay. No, it connects a little bit about this. In relation to STS issues, you were speaking about, the Indian societies and how science is being constructed in Indian societies versus the European or the Western societies. So, I understand that the thrust is more on the kinds of knowing and the engagement with knowledge, but just as this whole exercise of looking at society as a whole, as a monolithic, is this something which is something that we should go ahead with, or we need to unpack it further and understand nuanced ways of how societies have also engaged and reciprocated to knowledge differently?
No, very true. I totally agree with you. That's what I meant when I said that just like you break up different elements of science, you have to really break up different elements of society and what constitutes these fractured parts of society. Because when science engages with society, it is not a monolithic science, it engages monolithic society. As I said, some parts of it would be some scientists in defense labs will engage with the politicians within society. That's not science-society relationship. You have, for example, a large number of scientists who are in the early, adult literacy movement, like the PPST and so on, who are scientists who are interested in, adult literacy, questions of rationality, who would engage with certain kinds of communities. And that is also a science-society relation, very different from the weapon manufacturers and the politicians. So that is a given. But once we do that, how do we then look at these smaller microscopic connections between many of them? And especially in the Indian case, how do we make sense of it? Because in the larger global discourse on it, it seems at first level very difficult to do the nitty-gritty of the complexity of Indian society and Indian science with that. But one thing which is true about the tendency to have unified discourses, it's really surprising to me how much Indian science has ridden on the, as I say, on the coattails of scientific temper, and that the function of science is to eradicate superstition and blind belief, the extension, religious beliefs of people, not of other scientists, of all people. How much of it they have been able to use this particular image of science without telling us how, if I do physics, I'm going to be able to get rid of caste inequalities or my religious beliefs? How is it that people who are, when questions of religion and sociality, so for example, in our book, in the last chapter, when we talk about the idea of Maitri, we point out that the questions of desire and vulnerability are very closely related to the idea of individual and social. When vulnerability increases, the index of sociality increases. When people feel far more vulnerable, they come together more easier. When desire increases, when society is present just as a function to satisfy individual human desire, then the individual component increases enormously. And that is what we really see around us. COVID is a very good example of that. So there are different ways of looking at what would constitute the function of a society. You could look at it in terms of this. You could look at it in terms of ethical functioning of societies and so on. So how is it that the scientists have gotten away with this narrative? That's to me very surprising. In the mainstream media, I mean, even today, and there are terrible people who do terrible things. There's no doubt about it. So what happens with Dabolkar and others are, horrendous things, and they should be punished. They should be attacked, whatever it is, the people who did it, etc. But to reduce that naively to certain so-called, and what is very worrying is for many of these people, the target of them are always the rural and the rural first and then the rural poor. So one of my friends who's a very well-known writer but who lives in rural, India, once told me that he was so upset about these so-called rationality debates. He says it makes all of us as if we are all dumb fools, without recognizing the inherent rationality present in human action, in culture, religion, arts, literature, music, etc. Rather than engaging with these multiple rationalities and recovering, in fact, much of the greatest protest against blind superstition and inhuman practices have come from music, in protest songs. So how did these guys get away with it and get a huge community of government to keep funding them about it year after year? That's an interesting social phenomenon. It says something about our Indian society in that sense. Okay, so do we have time? Maybe 5 minutes, I would say. There's one question about environmental sciences. Again, like biology, raises a very deep question about what is the difference between science and society, nature and the social. Whether you can even look at processes in environmental sciences, including, let's say, animal behavior or things like various kinds of environmental pollution and so on, and what kind of relationship between science and society can we really look at. One of the things here is, like, I've been seeing this repeatedly. I'll give you one example, so I think it captures it very well. In the last few years, there has been so much debate about water and the questions about what we are doing with river water, etc., etc. So I have been part initially when some group of scientists, with interest in social science, I guess, I don't know, wanted to, they had some huge money from the government given to these scientists to solve the water problem. So I've sat through a couple of their meetings, and I was like quite aghast to discover that to them, like for example, the river linking around the country, or how they even look at the problem, was by some people, given their background, it was very technological. Some, it was very quantitative and very quote unquote scientific. So here was a question about water, which is a product which is as much alive as humans in terms of cultural narratives of people. It influences the very idea of civilizations in these various communities, which then, in front of my eyes, with the huge amount of money given by some government agency, they converted this whole thing into a kind of a scientific object. They created water into a scientific object, just like you create environment into a scientific object. And in that creation, there were no questions of gender. One person who was initially working on this and who was in gender studies, who brought a lot of this work on the ground with that, was very soon out of that committee, and she herself said, I can't make sense of what they're talking about, because part of it was, like, another person in the committee told me, she's just talking, she has no clarity, she's just talking about some society, women and all that, but this is a problem we need to solve. It's this is the only way we can solve this problem. So I think definitely, even though the question of the environmental sciences, the kind of challenges it raises is how these forms of scientific forms of creation and preparation happen for all this. So they know how to solve these problems, because eventually, whether it is water or air or anything else, it doesn't matter to them, because as long as they can put it into framework they are comfortable, they can do anything with anything. Even if you take God and put God into a framework which is amenable, they can do it. Not a problem for them, right? Because that's the power of science also, and that's the limitation of it also. There have been, of course, other approaches to environmental. I'm talking about it in the Indian context. I mean, there have been very important approaches in environmental science which have been very humanistic, which have gone back to very important questions of ethics of nature and so on. But I'm just saying what's happening in the larger ways in which the increasing amount of scientists who are entering into these questions, who look at it as a technological solution to a natural problem. Yeah, I think Lalan's point about Bruno Latour is you can see that it is there is, with the post-humanists, continuing the continuity of beings from humans to machines, etc. One useful way of looking at it. In our book on that everyday social, there is we begin with also a critique of Latour and the idea of the social and his own things on social. But of course, he's been an extremely influential writer on science and society, and I think particularly his work on nature, more political in some sense than what we've been trying to do, and focusing a lot more on how to think through this conceptually, because for this community of people, we have to find resources first to think through this question. And finally, maybe the acknowledgement of social inequality to reduce the sharpness of science. That's an interesting question. If we open up the spaces of whom you take into science institutions, would that decrease the, let's say, sharpness, quality of science? That's part of the argument which scientific communities do. They say, look, we can open up. I mean, the problem is so endemic. We have to think about it as a social problem, which is that it is not just about the lack of other castes present in science institutions dominantly. It is also about religion. The number of Muslims who are part of our scientific institutions, knowledge producing, policy making, and these are policies which affect the larger notions of social development and progress, that's very small. Abdul Kalam is a massive exception to this whole rule. And we have to, as social scientists will have to ask this question about this phenomenon. What is it? It's not that we are looking for direct representation of population, etc. I mean, that's one criteria. But we just look at the number of people who are part of our major institutions. So what kind of interests are being promoted here? What kind of images of society, nation, science are being promoted here? And therefore, the question of whether if science is more inclusive, would it reduce the sharpness? I really don't, I don't think so. I don't think so for a variety of reasons. One, that I think, okay, and I'm saying something which is, I'm sure many people may find it problematic, but it's a point for a larger discussion. I think that the homogeneity of our scientific institutions are the cause for its, average nature, average science we produce in India. So let's assume you have chosen all these people on your best thing. You have excluded all these people who are political, who have come from history of inequalities, and then say, oh, it's all for merit, it's all for good science. And then, okay, let's accept that. And then ask, what is your good science over the last 50 years? What is it that you have been able to do? Okay, I said I want to be very careful. It's not to reduce it to individual scientists. We have very good individual scientists, but we are also talking about science as a system. And not all individual scientists produce the kind of work which everybody does. There are some who are very productive, who produce great work, and there are some who may not, but that's part of any institution. There's not a mistake in that. But the question you have to ask is, okay, if you have kept these people out, then what did you then produce which has been so great that it is equal to the cost of keeping these people out? Or if you had said that allowing these people into these institutions would have allowed completely different narratives of doing science, experimenting, who knows what kind of stuff that imagination would come in. A very diverse imagination, which is very important for all academic work. How can we say that a very diverse imagination of different communities which come together would not have actually produced far better science than that we have produced? So it's a counterfactual. There's no quick answer to it. But I'm saying, if you look at what we have done, maybe it doesn't. I am not convinced that keeping the communities out has actually helped Indian science. I really think it has played a major, has had a major impact on the quality of science we have produced. Okay, even if they are not interested in the social issues, then at least for the quality of the science that we produce, it would have been far more diverse and useful. Okay, I'll take the other questions then on Thursday. I'll just continue this and go into some aspects of, okay, let me look at the last one since it connects to what I just said. Society maintained a higher education, excluding people from certain background. How do they identify each other? Yeah, I mean, okay, and this is the point I was also saying, what Rinsha has written. How is it that they maintain a society by excluding people from certain background and succeed in silencing the voice? How do they identify? The answer to this is really depressing, and I don't know if I should, I mean, you know it, you have seen it, I'm sure, in various places. But when I have seen it working at the leadership level in many of these institutions, it is quite shocking. You don't have voices of these communities at the leadership level, and that's a major problem. In other words, unless you have an accountability fixed into these systems. So reservation was one such accountability, but it's got vitiated by all these idiots. So, and I think if that had not been there, we would have been much worse. And that has been, I think, one of the more useful and more proactive things we've been able to do. There may be questions of how effective, etc. I don't think they are quite meaningless questions in this context. But this is the larger question, and I will just stop here because the question Rinsha is asking, how does such a virtual presence of elite community silence the people, even those who reach such institutions after overcoming systematic exclusion? Is it a lack of scientific temper or rationality? It's whatever. So let me just end at that point because it's a very important point about the idea of authority and the authority of the social. How do these social groups work? How do they derive their authority from? And caste is a very good example of what in our book Gopal and me call as the invisible authority or the non-agential authority. This is a very good example of what we call as non-agential authority, because it is not one person who is sitting there and saying, don't let these people in. In fact, you go talk to all of them, they'll all tell you, no, let everybody in, we are very open. You go to any science institute and show me one person who agrees that what we are doing is because there is systematic exclusion. They will tell you, no, this is not true, it's completely open. If they are capable, they'll come. It's not our problem. And part of it, and you can never find out one person who is really driving this. It's not one individual. There is no Manusmriti there which is operating. Many of these guys in these institutions may not even know that there is a text like that. That's not the point. The point is, how does this invisible authority act? The non-agential. You can't hold one person and say, what's happening? Why did you do this? And that is something which we have, as I said, extensively discussed in our book. I'm not trying to say that go read the book. No, it's not for that reason I'm telling you, but I'm saying it's a much larger, I think, a very central question which you have asked, and I think that's something which we are very, very concerned about. How is it that a virtual presence of these elite communities can function so powerfully today that with all this amount of social exposure, media, social media, questions of accountability, they have been able to get away from this. And I know, for example, and I don't know if this has changed. Okay, I was told this, I should check it, and if any of you know to the contrary, please correct me. but I was told that there is a parliamentary exclusion to the, there's an exception to the reservation bill passed by the parliament. Is one of the things in the parliament, one of the bills, that ISRO and DAE will not have reservation in the scientific cadre. Which means, as far as I know, it's true for our science institutes. So since TIFR comes under DAE, for example, and that's true actually, because I was talking to somebody from TIFR some time back, and they said for faculty positions, there is no questions of reservations. Whereas for administrative posts, there are. And it's shocking that because these are supposed to be, knowledge of great importance to the nation, that you cannot dilute it by reservation. I mean, what is the government thinking and doing when they do this, when they accept this? And what are the scientific community doing when they allow such exceptions? I don't get it. I mean, they are fighting all kinds of, they say they come out on protest for this and that. When this endemic questions of caste and gender are abound in their institutes, what happens to scientific temper among themselves? And that's the question you're asking, and I think the answer is more about questions of social rationalities. What Gopal and me call as the ethical rationalities, which really need to order societies, not some utilitarian rationalities. Okay, I'm sorry, I've just been going on. So maybe I'll stop here now. Ritesh, what do you think?
Yeah. But that closing note is highly appreciated, I must say. I've been a student of TIFR and
oh, is really it? Sorry, I hope I...
No, it's good.
Okay. Yeah. No, it is a problem. I'm saying, it's not about criticizing them too, but I'm just saying, why is it that when they perpetuate it year after year in their hiring, aren't they asking this question? Aren't they asking this question? Are we accepting, and some of them will immediately come out and protest against some political thing. And then they should be asking, for example, Hindutva, which they should protest, but then they should ask how what they are doing is also so closely aligned with the Hindutva policies and the politics of caste within Hindutva. Why is it that that doesn't strike them? Or what is this idea of this great quality in that science which they think these people have not had the capacity and I'm going to keep them out? We should also take their answer to it. They say, no, we are not God. We are completely, we are not, we do not take a conscious decision against this. That is not true. Okay. And that is just an accident. We've just got the best people in. That itself is a faulty argument. I can give you, I'll end this last example. And again, at NIAS once, when we were talking about all this stuff, and a couple of my colleagues, I mean, I think I don't want to say much about their policies towards social justice, which I think is extremely bad. But we thought that, when we choose PhD students, we are completely close to the question of caste. Okay, and after 2 years, we found, as one of the PhD students pointed out when we were talking about this, he said, you guys don't even realize this. All your 20 students in the PhD program are forward caste. And you're saying that we are not going to choose. And yes, there is nothing. In principle, there is no marker which was visible, which you would say that they belong to this caste or that. Nowadays, people pull it out in various ways. Okay, but these that's what I'm talking about, the social authority, the invisible authority of the social, which functions like this. So if the TIFR scientists tell me that no, we have tried, but you've not got good people, or we got 1 out of 100, it's true for gender too, for women too. Then we have to say you have not understood the social nature, the particular specific social nature which defines science communities within the Indian society.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for also the audience I wanted to thank. And it has been a wonderful session, like every time.
Thank you, Ritesh. Bye.
Yeah. Bye. Leave the meeting.